Hello everybody, I'm the Lion. Good afternoon to all. It is for me a real pleasure to be here in Hungary, being the first president of Argentina, to be for the first time in this beautiful country. Thanks you. A country that I admire for its brilliant minds, especially for one of the greatest geniuses of humanity, for example, John von Neumann, and a whole tradition of great mathematicians. Also a country with a huge history, a great tradition, and above all, a country emblematic of the fight against collectivists. The other killer versions of collectivists, other versions of good globalists, socialists, or leftist models. A nation with which we share the love for ideas of freedom, and with which Prime Minister Viktor Orbán unites us in a personal brotherhood and a mutual feeling of admiration. It is also a pleasure to be part of a new edition of CIPA. The thanks to its organizers are never enough for the invitations and for the privilege of directing me once again to a public that wishes to carry the cultural battle all over the world. I consider if vital to keep this flame alive. I am referring to the ideas of freedom, that at all times there are those who are trying to extinguish them. Events like this contribute to this fire to continue burning and to be a guide for all the men in the world. Today I come to talk to you about a core concept of our government, that although we have been in action since the first moment, we have only put an end to words recently. I speak neither more nor less of morality as a state policy. This is, in a few words, a methodology of decision-making based on an inflexible order of priorities, which I will go on to explain. As you know, every decision that is taken from a role of the government, you have three variables to consider. The first is the moral variable, that is, if it is ethically correct. As Marco Aurelius said, which I summarize perfectly in his Meditations, if it is not correct, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. The second variable to consider is if the measure is economically efficient, that is, if it generates prosperity. And finally, thirdly, there is the variable of political utility, which is the last in the line of priorities, that is, whether the politician he makes the decision shows him personally or not. For us, we think of generations instead of political cycles. This order is clear and self-evident. The morally correct, that is, the defense of the right to life, to liberty and to property, always without exception, they are first, and the political calculation, always without exception, is at the end. This moral framework works as a platform. I would say the only moral platform created to date, on which can naturally arise the capitalism of free enterprise, the most efficient economic system when it comes to generating prosperity and wealth, and get thousands of millions out of poverty. And finally, it is economic growth that ends up generating political utility, because any politician under whose mandate his people prosper will get some form of political income. In Argentina, for 100 years, it was diametrically the opposite. Politicians put in doubt property rights. They issued money without backing. They indebted to entire generations that have not yet been born, and an endless amount of economic and moral aberrations of every kind, all with the main objective of favoring their political trajectories in the short time of each phase election of turn, in detriment not only of the material well-being of their peoples, but of their moral integrity. And with this I mean that the politician transmits his obsession for the short term to the market and to the population, obligating it to adapt temporary frameworks increasingly narrowed That is, this state that should more than any other actor in a society fight for long-term interests of a nation, ends without being able to think even 3 years. In this way, the process of civilization is reversed, pushing people towards a state of barbaric immediacy, where day by day prevails over the future project, and that no time is clearer than in the inflationary processes, where uncertainty over tomorrow's prices leads to a destruction of savings and today's production. So we inherited a country that had been repeating this harmful behavior for years. That left us at the end of 2023 at the edge of the worst crisis in our history, with an inflation of more than 200%, and that led directly to hyperinflation, since we had a daily inflation of 1.5%. It was thanks to applying our heuristics with conviction that we managed to get the country afloat. That is, from an inflation that would travel around 15,000 a year, we went to an inflation that is around 13, and probably at the end of our mandate in this first term, we will end it by ending it. In the economic field, the search for political convenience led our politicians to constantly indebt themselves, to finance themselves and their friends. At the time of paying, given that adjusting the expense and fulfilling the contracts was politically unacceptable to them, they opted to default once and for all in our debts. In this way, we were able to increase the trust of our country around the world and its economic growth capacity. Since that was not enough to stop spending compulsively, they continued to do it by financing it with monetary emissions, dissolving the salaries of all Argentinians and destroying our currency, to which we took 13 zeros. In successive inflationary processes that include doses of pre-inflation without war, and the fact that we managed to avoid in time by assuming our mandate, and all this always in a context of high tax pressure and regulatory madness that made trade unfeasible. Without a doubt, the party of public spending translated into chronic tax deficit, obedient at all times to the coldest political needs of the leaders. For 100 years, our politicians, either out of malice or ignorance, they thought that the optimal way to economic efficiency was centralized planning. This was a terrible mistake that led us to the most terrible of failures. We were becoming Cuba and immediately stopped in Venezuela. But this choice does not apply only to Argentina, but can be seen as a constant throughout the history of humanity. All Western countries have suffered to a greater or lesser extent from the fatal arrogance of politicians. Without going further, the Soviet Union that promised paradise on earth ended up causing the death of 100 million people and the return of cannibalism in a time when the global trend was prosperity. The Great Experiment, as some Western socialist intellectuals called it, from the commodity of their prosperous countries, came to impose long prison sentences to those who desperately for hunger that generated their failed system. They stole a handful of flour or a bunch of corn. Or what to say about Cuba, that after almost 70 years of its supposed revolution, that only mattered to the Castro family, they left a population added to the mass of this misery. And this week, they had to renounce a change of economic model. That is, they're having their own perestroika. And that surely before half a year, with the leadership of that great man who is Donald Trump, we will see Cuba free. In each of the cases, we can see that the take of these terrible decisions that sacrifice freedom and the auto-supposed efficiency was guided by political utility. Planning gives infinite resources to the communist on duty to do what he wants. And all these mistakes or evils happen because they abandoned to think first of all in the moral order, or rather they did it obeying their untwisted moral order. That's why we call communists who want to cross the same path. In the Western countries that manage to accumulate wealth, doing exactly the opposite. And that is also valid for those who are of good manners, the socialists of good manners, that dress up as good people, and that in the end dictate policies that exterminate nations. Because although they always deny the success of failed experiments, and they seek to demarcate themselves, calling themselves socialist or social democrat, they share the same principles. For all this we, as I explained, take the opposite path. Although everyone said it was impossible, in our first month of mandates we made the biggest adjustment in the history of humanity on public spending to phase out debt payments and thus begin to recompose the credibility of our country, more or less so that they have an order and magnitudes. We load the public spending in real times, 30%, that is to say an adjustment of 5 points at the GDP, that they said it was impossible to do it alone a mandate, and we did it in a month. Because in a giant state that exploits a citizen, it is just before anything to lower the weight of the state. Although everyone said it was impossible, at the 6 months of our mandate, we eliminated all the sources of monetary emission to stop scoffing at Argentines for seniority and thus recompose confidence in our currency, fundamental condition to be able to grow economically. Specifically, this refers to the quasi-fiscal deficit, that is to say the deficit of the central bank, which was of the order of 10 points of the GDP, and we were able to fix that in 6 months. That means that in the course of 6 months, in our government we made an adjustment of 15 points of the GDP. That is to say we returned to the Argentines of good about $90 billion. Applause. Although everyone said it was impossible, we began to gradually open our economy so that our truly competitive sectors could compete globally and proliferate, and so that the Argentines could access goods of maximum quality at the best price. And we will not rest until we become the nation, the freest and most open nation in the world. As a result of adopting these measures, thanks to our moral compass, we have managed to lower poverty from 57% to 30%. That is to say, we took out of poverty more than 15 million Argentines, which obviously represents having taken millions of Argentines out of poverty. We have also managed to lower the country's risk of the order of the 3,000 basic points to around 600 points. And we have started to receive investments in our soil for approximately $100 billion. Here in Europe, on the contrary, they've been taking the decision-making matrix, as it happened in Argentina, although at another pace. First they analyze what the politician or the bureaucrat wants, then what is economically efficient, and finally they analyze what is morally correct, if they even do this. And they always do it disguised as virtue. In the name of compassion, they attack property rights. In the name of equality, they destroyed merit. In the name of empty universalism, they gave the sovereignty of the nations to bureaucrats that no one chose. Every time the European policy made a bad decision, they did it with a noble cause in hand. And that is a trick, that is the trap, because behind each noble cause, there is a very concrete political equation. To create dependence is to create vouchers. Each subsidy is a bought vote. Each regulation is a paid favor. Each open border is an expanded electoral pattern. They don't do it out of compassion. They do it because it suits them. And they put a humanitarian flag on top, so that no one dares to question them. Let's take, for example, economic policy and immigration policy. As we all know, Europe is a nanny state. That is to say, proportionately remove those that generate the most wealth, violating the principle of property rights and equality before the law, in the process to redistribute it with the rest of society in the form of services. In other words, they consider that the economy is like a cake. They're focused on managing and deciding what piece corresponds to whom. Instead of focusing on that, the cake continues to grow. That generates economic stagnation, with which it has been observed in a region, and the further away from the individual is to the summit of power. Worse are the consequences of this attempt to plan. The national suggestion to unilateral dictatorships and supranational organizations replace sovereignty and individual freedoms with the whims of the bureaucrats on duty. When power is separated from the responsibility that representation brings, it becomes tyranny very quickly. In fact, in the recent speech, he mentioned my dear friend Santiago Abascal, the pigeonhole tyrants they have in Spain. If we add to this the migratory issue, that what it does is increase indiscriminately the amount of receptors of pieces of the cake, without any need for any kind of contribution. The population ends up being scammed, that paid taxes for so many years, returning them a system that eliminated the collapse. The result of this action, Europe was left without growth, without an empire in the law, and today is already making it clear that as leaders, they also remain without any political credibility. And none of this can take us by surprise, because as the phrase prays, we can ignore reality, but we can never ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. Ayn Rand. And with this I want to say something that seems obvious, that politics is in charge of darkening. Ideas are not abstract. Ideas have real consequences for the real life of people. When a society chooses freedom, things get better. We are seeing this in Argentina. When a society chooses socialism, things get worse. We saw it in the Soviet Union. We see it in Cuba. We see it in Venezuela. We saw it during 100 years of progressive decline in Argentina. It is not a matter of luck. It is not a matter of natural resources. It is not a matter of history or geography. It is a matter of decisions. The nations that embrace freedom, property rights, and the moral order of Western civilization progress. Those who abandon it decay, always without exception. That is why what is at stake in every election is not only who governs, it is what direction the people takes, and that direction matters. That is why Prime Minister Orbán and the Hungarian people have it very clear. Being a country that lived in its own flesh the misfortunes of communism, today they face the same spirit that I'm talking about. They have put their trust in the determination and courage of Prime Minister Orbán to take it forward. I'm glad that he is someone worthy of admiration for his huge task. Hungary has become then a country that decides to do the right thing because of what is well seen. That relentless action led them to stay firm with the immigration policy, going against the hand of the whole region that pressured them to open their borders against Europe. Because of doing what left the politicians well in the headlines of Diario del Mundo. Today they're facing a crisis disproportionate in this matter and so many others. In this sense, I feel that with my friend Victor, we have something important in common. Both of us began to fight these battles much before it was popular to give them. When I said in Argentina that socialism was destroying us, I was a pro-right. They did not invite me to the programs. They did not call me from any party. The journalists looked at me like I was crazy, and yet I kept saying it because it was the right thing. Victor, in parallel, was the first to stand up in front of the whole of Europe, well thinking to say what no one wanted to hear, that the West was in danger, that Europe was committing suicide, that massive immigration without control was not an act of generosity, but an act of irresponsibility with its own peoples. He said it when it cost him to say it. That is called courage. Today, years later, the facts gave reason to those who said the truth in time. And this is exactly what distinguishes a statistician from a politician. The statistician says what is true before it is convenient to say it. That is why my message tonight for all of you is the following. When the bad impose themselves as a norm, it is our duty to defend with more courage than ever ethics, morals, justice and truth. No matter how much they try, no matter how much they invest in media, no matter how much they impose legislation, we must not let ourselves be convinced that the bad is good. The bad is bad even if millions of people defend it. In this sense, I want to add a phrase that is in the novel Linara by Virgilio. That Ludwig van Mises used to repeat. First I am going to say in Latin, which obviously I am going to pronounce it out loud. And then I am going to say it in English. And then I am going to say it in Spanish. And then I am going to say it in Spanish. And then I am going to say it in Latin, which obviously I am going to pronounce horribly bad. But I am going to try. And it says, Tu nisi molis et contra audentia iter. It is never given to evil. If not, fight it with more strength. And Victor is doing it. Today, we are facing a reconfiguration of the world order and the way in which we are inserted in this new world that is being met for the time and the destiny of our nations. The era of global cooperation without a moral compass has ended. Too many institutions that were born to mediate conflicts and guarantee peace were captured by bureaucrats who turned it into instruments to impose an ideological agenda on the peoples. What should have been an impartial referee turned into an actor with his own agenda, and the result is in sight. Times of change require a correct diagnosis, a moral compass calibrated and the courage tact. In this world, more and more the waters were split between the free nations and the underprivileged nations. Hungary and Argentina are two nations that are very clear, and they are embracing the winds of change. That is why we support initiatives like that of the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. When countries that share principles act with decision and coordination, real progress is achieved without being trapped in inertia or in ambiguity that often paralyzes certain international organizations. Argentina has joined since the first day because we believe in a diplomacy that takes risks to achieve peace. In our country, that path already begins to give concrete results. The macroeconomic order, the respect and strictness of property rights, the defense of life and a recovery of clear rules have returned predictability, investment and growth. That process does not go unnoticed in the region and in the world. More and more countries observe this experience as a reference and begin to follow a similar path. For example, now Argentina is in condition to guarantee the energy security of Europe. We are experiencing a gold fever in energy investments. Imagine that by 2030 we will export above $30 billion per year. Europe has been looking for energy independence for years. We offer something better, a reliable partner with huge reserves, and a government that honors its contracts. Argentina once again occupies a place of prominence, not from the imposition, but from the example and what it has to offer to the world, promoting a wider movement that seeks to recover the greatness of America on the basis of freedom. That movement already has a name in our continent. It is a decision to make America great again. It is the conviction that only on the basis of freedom, order and respect for the values that gave rise to our civilization, it is possible to build a future of prosperity. And that same conviction is what today begins to open up in Europe. Europe does not need to reinvent itself. and needs to meet itself, return to its roots, regain confidence in its history, and leave behind the logic of permanent guilt. On that path, Hungary occupies a central place, and Viktor Orbán has become one of the most clear and brave voices in the task of returning to Europe its course. Now Hungary is approaching a new turning point, where two opposite moral models are put into play to lead the country in the coming years. That communism that used to appear under the Soviet flag, today it is shown under another appearance. It is hidden behind the multiple noble and humanitarian causes, all in an independent appearance, but intimately linked by a common agenda of war against tradition and hatred towards everything that we consider good, beautiful and sacred. In a few weeks, the Hungarian people will be pronounced again. Today more than ever, we must be clear what is really at stake. What Hungary defines will echo throughout Europe, because when a nation stands up to the pressures of political coercion, it shows other countries that it is also possible to resist and overcome. When a nation decides to defend freedom to its families, to its borders, and to its traditions, it reminds them of other countries anesthetized by their decadent engineers that there is still time to react. And when a leader like Viktor Orbán gives that fight without asking for permission, it becomes a lighthouse for all those who do not accept that the fate of the West is an administrated crepuscule. Dear friend Viktor, you count on our respect, with our admiration and with our support. Hungary has a voice, a leader of exceptional courage, and once indispensable for the future of Europe. And all of us who give this battle in the name of freedom, we know that when a man of state plants firmly in defense of his people, not only protects his nation, it also gives hope to the world. That is why many thanks to all. May God bless Hungary, may God bless Argentina, may the forces of heaven accompany us, and long life freedom, damn it. Many thanks to all. Eternal rock and roll. Early in the morning, the morning with stories. How to forget them? When I carry my songs, they are defeated in my love. Victory is coming. They are defeated in my love. And I keep singing.